Hi, this is Jeff Ryan. Welcome to Tales from the Cabin. I'm really excited about this week's episode. This story has taken me to northern Minnesota twice and Davenport, Iowa once. It's a near and dear story to me. It's particularly compelling because I'm always intrigued by what draws people into a lifelong relationship with nature and even an advocacy for it. So to go back to the beginning, in Davenport, Iowa in the late 1800s, a boy named Ernest Oberholtzer was born. He was born into a fairly well-to-do family that came into hardship very quickly, predominantly emotional hardship. When Ober was about 4 and his older brother was 6, his parents got divorced. His father left the family, leaving the mother and the 2 young boys. About a year later, Ernest's older brother Frank died unexpectedly, presumably after a fall down the stairs in front of the family home. Ernest's mother, Rosa, took that loss extremely hard. In fact, she spent every day at the cemetery grieving the loss of Frank, with young Ernest in tow. The cemetery was kind of a difficult place for a 5-year-old boy to be hanging out during the day. And a grave digger with the last name of Burke, his first name is kind of lost to the ages, but Burke took young Ernest under his wing and taught him about different natural things, particularly around Duck Brook, which ran adjacent to the cemetery. And he would supervise young Ernest down there and show him about plants and animals and urge the kid to play in the mud, build bridges out to imaginary islands, that sort of thing, and taught him about the wildlife in the area. As Ober's perspectives broadened, he grew up on the Mississippi after all, he would see these boats coming down, barges coming down the Mississippi laden with huge logs and wonder, where did these logs come from? And from a very early age, it sort of planted the seed of wanting to get to the North Country someday. So Ernest did fairly well in school, enough to get into Harvard on a trial basis and then make it full time. He ended up graduating in 4 years from Harvard. He studied landscape architecture and actually went to work for the famed landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted. Did that for about a year, but the wilderness was calling him in northern Minnesota to a lake called Rainy Lake, which is a couple miles east of International Falls. Soon after moving in there for good, he met an Ojibwa by the name of Billy McGee. And Billy McGee was some 30 years older than Ober, as Ober became known. I keep calling him Ober, but that's because that's what his friends called him. Billy McGee taught Ober a lot about Native American lore, particularly Ojibwa lore, taught him about paddling, canoe paddling skills, navigation, living in the woods, living off the land, etc. So he was kind of Burke on steroids, if you will. And they became very good friends. And this was in an age when exploration, particularly polar exploration, was at its zenith, and the early 19-teens. And Ober had dreams of becoming a great explorer and becoming well known for that, as many young men did. During one of the winters, in his early years of living on Rainy Lake, he came up with this wild idea of trying to do a canoe trip from Mallard Island to Hudson Bay and back. And it was a crazy idea because almost none of the area had been mapped. I mean, all they really knew was Rainy Lake, Hudson Bay, everything in between was unknown. In fact, when he asked Billy McGee to go with him, who he initially said, basically, that's even too wild for me, but eventually he came around to it, and the Canadian government, the province of Ontario, said, can you please map this place on your way through, because we don't really know what the interior looks like. So anyway, they went on this trip, and they had plotted out X amount of time, and they had to really hustle to get to Hudson Bay and back before winter, before everything got iced in again, and the rivers and streams became impassable. So they got way behind schedule, in part because they kept taking offshoots of the river that were dead ends and having to circle back again. They didn't have a map. They didn't know where they were going. They had to just keep poking at it till they got through. So they were 12 weeks behind schedule. They were running woefully short on food. They were ill-equipped for deep winter. And they were doing stuff like harvesting brush and having it around their feet to keep them warm in the canoe. But they got to this place called Newellton Lake, and they were really fearing for their lives at this point. They were probably halfway to Hudson Bay. And Ober had this idea that he'd better leave a note for his mother in case something happened to them. At least she'd find out what had happened. So he had this powdered milk can that was much, in those days, it was sealed like a paint can with a lid that, seals down. And he decided to take the empty milk can, put a note in it, and if they could get up on this ridge, the high point, which actually wasn't all that high, probably 600, 700 feet or something above lake level, they could build a cairn, a rock pile called a cairn, and put the milk can inside that. Hopefully someday someone would be intrigued by what they saw, find the can, get the note to his mother. So wrote the note, got up there, built the cairn, put the milk can in there, went back down again, got in the canoe, miraculously made it to Hudson Bay a couple weeks later. So they get to the western edge of Hudson Bay, they work their way 100 or so miles down the west shore, find another river, start heading back down. They get as far as they can toward Winnipeg, and they get into a town and try to take the last steamship home to International Falls, and they missed it by 2 days. So back in the canoe they went, another 260 miles, made it to another town which had rail service, and got them back to Rainy Lake again. They were so exhausted when they got back from the trip and so weak that it literally took them all winter to bulk up again and get their health back. But they did. And shortly thereafter, a couple years go by, Ober has no luck publishing a book about his exploits. I can't say no luck. He finally sells it to a railroad for $400, the manuscript, but it didn't have the bestseller status that he had certainly hoped for. Shortly thereafter, Ober was approached by a guy who was starting a farming operation, a vegetable farming operation, and Ober jumped at the chance to do it. So Rosa went up with him, and they started working for this farmer and making a living up there. And a couple years later, a couple years into it, the guy who ran the farming operation ended up going belly up. And as part of the settlement, if you will, what the dues that were still owed Ernest and Rosa, he offered Ober an island called Mallard Island. From there, the rest is history. Ober lived on Mallard Island the rest of his life for all intents and purposes until he couldn't live there anymore, which was into a very ripe old age. So he's living on the island, and he gets wind of the fact that this local paper company magnate named Bacchus proposes building 7 dams in the vicinity that will provide all these jobs and new paper mills, and it'll be a wonderful thing. But Ober starts reading the proposal and realizes that, yeah, the jobs would be nice, but what he's proposing is going to put this whole area 30 feet underwater. And all the cottages that are owned by his friends and families that have lived there on these lakes for generations are going to be wiped out. So using some of the connections that he has both in the community, the growing connections that he has in the community, he gets a little bit of a groundswell going to stop this thing, but it isn't going to be enough. And he starts using some of the connections that he made at Harvard to try to put together a plan, and gets a couple lawyers from the Twin Cities involved, and the thing starts growing, this groundswell to stop the dam project, and it ends up becoming a commission that is proposed to help stop this thing, and Ober is nominated to be the president of the commission, and he agrees to do that for 6 months. Well, 6 months become 30 years, and for the purposes of this story, I won't get into the weeds, but suffice to say that by the time they were done, they had successfully established Boundary Waters Canoe area, Quetico Superior area. He was instrumental in starting Voyageurs National Park, and was directly or indirectly responsible for millions and millions of acres being preserved forever up in that region of the United States and Canada. An amazing feat for a soft-spoken man with a heart of gold and a passion for the wilderness and what the wilderness has meant for him and others like him, like us, who have all benefited from being in nature's thrall. So at about age 73, Ober has had this thing simmering in the background for most of his adult life, and he lets it be known to this youngster that he's constantly paddling with named Bob Hilke. Ober has taught Bob Hilke so much about paddling skills, wilderness lore, everything that Billy and Ober have cumulatively learned is now being passed on to a kid who's 50 years younger than Ober. And so they do a lot of paddling around the lake and nearby tributaries over the years. And every once in a while, Ober lets it be known that he'd like to go back to Newellton Lake and see if that milk can is still there. So very fortunately, on my last trip up to Ober's Island and to the International Falls area, I had the honor of meeting Bob Hilke and interviewing him. And oh my gosh, what a great, great guy. And he opened up his home and his heart, he and his wife, and we had a great afternoon. And one of the stories he told me was the story of going back for the milk can. And so the day Bob Hilke got out of school between freshman and sophomore year, the day he arrived back at home, at his parents' home, Ober was standing in the driveway saying, "It's time to go see if that milk can is still there." 2 days later, they were in a canoe bound for Newellton Lake. They got all the way up there, and the wind was so hellacious that they could not get across the lake. The headwinds were really dangerous, whitecaps. Well, it just so happened that the Canadian version of NOAA was up there doing some weather study, and they had a compound there on the shore, the same shore that Ober and Bob Hilke were trapped on, and said, "We have a boat with a motor, we'll give you a ride over." So they gave them both a ride over, and they climbed up the ridge, Bob and Ober, and lo and behold, there was the cairn. So they go up to the cairn with this great sense of anticipation and incredulousness and dismantle it and find the milk can inside it. Ober is beyond excited and like a little kid, as Bob Hilke described it. Opens up the can, no note inside, long gone. Legend has it that someone found the note in there, took the note out, left the can there, and took the note to the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And it's been lost to history. There's no note of it that anyone knows of, and it was not preserved to anyone's knowledge. So nobody really knows what was in there except Ober. And I said to Bob Hilke, wasn't Ober disappointed not to find the note? And he said, no. He was really ecstatic to just know that the can was there, was still there. And he was really gracious enough to allow me to copy a picture of Ober finding the can and opening it. And also, at that point in the interview, Mr. Hilke said to me, "Wait one moment," and he went into another room and came back with the can and handed it to me and said, "Here," and it was like the holy grail of Ober, right? Just an amazing, amazing thing. It's so cool to me that Ober and Bob was able to help Ober circle back and find that thing that was so important to him, the connection to Ober's past trip, to Billy McGee, to his mother. Everything went full circle. And for me, it was an honor, as I said, to meet Bob Hilke, and it was really great. I am thankful that I took the time to go out there, because unfortunately, about a year ago, Bob Hilke and his wife were killed in an auto accident. They were on their way to visit their own family in Michigan and were hit. And it was just a horrible tragedy. And it made me realize that part of what's important in chasing down these stories is making those connections while we still can and making them in person. A friend of mine once told me, you can learn an awful lot at your computer, but it's not the same as being out in the world. And I really took that to heart. This really drives that home. So I hope you enjoy this story. It's a great one, I think, in so many levels, inspirational, and long live Ober's legacy and Bob Hilke's legacy. Two really amazing people from different generations that kept a legacy alive. Thanks again for joining me. If you'd like to support my work, please go to my website, jeffryanauthor.com, where you can check out my books and where to buy them. Or you can buy me a cup of coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Jeffrey Ryan. Support level starts as low as $5. Helps me put gas into the tank and continue hitting the road to research these stories and bring them back to you. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next week.